So last week we were looking at food systems as systems to do with the concentration and flows of capital and the application of technology, a very anthropocentric interpretation. This week we're going to jump to a different lens, and that's to one of ecology. So we're going to be using this week to spend as much time thinking about food systems as ecological systems as possible, to try to help you think about this in a natural way. And just to point out how this fits into the logic of the module, you will, of course, recall this diagram as an example of a food system map, and therefore as food system thinking. We've got the economic system. Down here there's the social system, the political system. Here we've got what's termed in this case as a biological system, but this could be the kind of environmental system. And in this case, we've got a number of categories that the author has chosen to focus on, which are quite high level. What we're going to do this week is to push, I think, sort of deeper than that into ecological ideas. So that's where this week hopefully fits into your evolving food systems thinking. And what I would like to talk about, some foundational ideas and a bit of a historical perspective. I want to think about human modifications of natural systems and processes, because that then allows us to think about, well, how might we change the way that humans interact with the natural environment as we're producing our food. So that is the logic. Humans need energy to exist. Where does all of this energy come from? Sun. Any other ideas? Primarily, yes, from the sun. And just as a reminder from the ecological stuff we did in the first year, there are a series of organisms, species in the world that are absolutely essential. Humans can't really capture the sun's energy for use in our biological processes. It has to be mediated by other species. So foundational here in our food pyramid, primary producers. So those species that can convert and make use of the energy from the sun for their own existence, which the food chain then communicates up to humans, which could be sitting up on the top there. We've obviously got questions of efficiency of energy transfer. So these guys are capturing quite a lot of energy by the time it's reaching humans at the top, who may be eating eagles or whatever that is. The energy ratios are a lot reduced. So we should think about food foundationally as performing this function down through the supply chain. We get some of our food, of course, from the marine environment as well as the terrestrial environment. So we have primary producers in the marine environment as well, capturing energy from the sun. Does anyone else know another source of energy that's sneaking in here? Geothermal, yes. So the Earth, the centre of the Earth, has some source of energy. Arguably, it kind of originally comes from the same bits as the sun. But there are organisms living under the Earth that are making use of this source of energy for their existence. This is an artist's impression of these species. And it's suggested that these species are where life on our planet originated in the first place. So these are the sort of the origin of all food webs ever. Right, ecosystems. So thank you, right smile there. These are in themselves a system, and we've thought about the systemic nature of ecosystems. But obviously these fit within the broader food system. What are ecosystems? Have a quick chat, 30 seconds with the person next to you. What do you remember from last year, from ecological principles, from environmental principles? Right. What have you got for me? What foundational principles did we learn last year? Please.
It's when a kind of set of species interact in a particular environment.
Okay, nice. So we've got the idea of interaction between different species. Fantastic. What else have we got in our, what do we know about ecosystems, please?
Could you mention like biotic and abiotic factors?
Oh, you could. What would that mean, please?
So like biotic, oh wait, no, which one's which now? Abiotic is like living things. Abiotic are things like wind and light and stuff.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you. What two categories of abiotic things might we think about in our ecosystem?
You say like the weather, so things that are like rain and that, and then also the conditions of like the soil that are flowing with. Is that not two categories?
Oh, yes, it is. Conditions, which might be kind of ambient temperature, the type of climate that there is, and resources. So resources are things that would be actively consumed, used by the biotic elements of an ecosystem. Conditions are things that don't get used up, but they set really important parameters for what type of species will be involved in our system. And if you're an ecologist, you'd be interested in the distribution and abundance of different species and thinking about why this is the case. So for our purposes, I want to just remind you it's important to think that ecosystems have evolved, literally and metaphorically, over millions of years based on very specific kind of conditions, resource availability, etc. Just as you have mentioned, they're about interactions of different biotic components, so plants and animals, including humans, in a relatively, well, in some states of stability, other states of change. And this is what ecology, of course, is interested in. So we've talked about the importance of conditions like temperature and resources, because these set the parameters. Can anyone remind us about the idea of redundancy? Particularly anyone who did ecological principles. Joe?
So redundancy is the fact that the more biodiverse a ecosystem is, so the more functional diversity it has, the more species there are to take over future niches if one goes extinct. So, well, yeah, it's more likely that another species can come in and take over the niche.
Nice, yes. So more things performing similar functions, so the kind of the depletion isn't a problem, and we can have greater stability. Now, just to I want to give a bit of an historical account. So obviously we're kind of thinking originally human ancestors were what could be described as niche takers as opposed to makers. So humans were adapted within this environment and modified it to a lot less extent than they do today. And this is obviously part of the obvious narrative about the way that humans have changed biological systems. Just a few interesting things to think about. Last week we were talking about technologies and capital being really important for social change. Here we can maybe think about some of the characteristics of humans as they evolve. So our ability to stand and run on two legs and have other appendages to perform tasks. At some point, humans start picking up what we would define as tools, so kind of extensions of our limbs to perform tasks. And we can start obviously thinking about food production. Spears would be a nice example. A key technology, arguably, would be humans' ability to use language to interact. So we talked in the first seminar about how knowledge was created, and we got to a point where we agreed that communication and oral communication was really important. So coordination becomes possible, planning becomes possible, which is a really important sort of, you could argue, technology in the development of all human development, but particularly food systems. Probably familiar with the idea that the sort of the precursors of modern humans, they hunted and they gathered. So this idea of taking the resources and the food as was encountered. However, something I think that's a bit more interesting is the argument that it was right at this early stage of human development that they actually started the humans became a driving force for the shaping of the biosphere. So 50,000 years ago was the first kind of major human impact on the lives of other species. So it's believed from the evidence that the megafauna, so the big animals that existed, were overhunted, overpredated by humans, getting wiped out. And some people say, well, this is the start. Actually, this is actually the start of the Anthropocene. It's not the Industrial Revolution in 1820 or whenever. It's 50,000 years ago. This is when we started mucking it up. And actually, this idea that we've only just started mucking it up and we've only just realized and we're really sorry is a really naive thing to think. Some people would say, and it's all part of the set of ideas that keeps us locked in a system that may lead to our horrible destruction. Let's not dwell on that too much. Another interesting point, if you're interested in the kind of the social development of humans, anthropologists argue that if what you're interested in is, as normally economists are, humans having the opportunity to chill out, to have leisure time, not to have to work, it was way better to be a hunter-gatherer, because the ratio of resources to humans was much more beneficial. So you could get up, go out, pick some berries, go with your mates, kill a wild pig, eat it, and then have the rest of the day off, sit around doing whatever hunter-gatherers did, drawing nice things on cave walls. So some people argue that actually, if this is what you care about, we've done the opposite of what development might expect, which I think is quite an interesting point. But let's focus back on food. Obviously, we're familiar with the idea that humans started to create their own kind of food systems and their own managed food systems slowly over time. Happens an awful long time ago, about 10,500 years. In some key locations, which might relate to our thinking, contemporary thinking about why ecological conditions, particularly climatic conditions, might be really important for human development, and that we've benefited from these things in the past, and maybe we don't want to muck it up. Some people also think about socio-economic technologies, and some people argue that the identification of what we would now say is private property was a key driver of development in the change in human food systems. So as soon as you start saying, well, these resources are mine for some reason, and you can't just take them without specific processes, you start to adjust individual incentives, either for cooperation or kind of individual innovation. So people look at the development of food systems from this perspective. Others say, well, maybe what started to change the way that humans kind of captured that energy was the problems they'd created. So once they'd eaten all the freely available stuff, the megafauna, which was relatively easy to hunt, this was an important driver in change. So thinking about the geographies and thinking about the kind of the importance of ecological conditions and the availability of resources, we've got here a map of the early sort of first agricultural revolution that scholars of this subject feel took place. And we can see we've got kind of concentrations spread across the world. Has anyone in their previous studies heard of the Fertile Crescent? Yeah, Alexandra, what do you know about this?
So the Fertile Crescent was an area like the Mesopotamia where they did have the other sort of agriculture, so like there's like grades I think like maize and sort of thing, and they have like a really ancient form of irrigation, which is still in parts of today, and it's like these channels.
Yeah, nice, thank you. So this is considered to be key in the development of human food systems, and therefore the way that humans start to modify naturally occurring food systems. And there's some interesting yeah, interesting evidence. So the idea that in this area there was a large concentration of wild wheat, so wheat that had developed, evolved in a relatively natural state, that humans started to identify as a useful food stock to have greater control over. And people who look into these things have looked back at the kind of the slow genetic change and the comparison of modern and later domesticated wheat varieties, and they trace it back and they say it all came from here. There was something really special that happened in the innovation of this particular geography, and this obviously has repercussions for global food now. If you're interested in kind of thinking about the mechanisms of this, theories suggest that it was a kind of incremental set of changes. So not really so much a revolution in the sense of that it all happened and everything radically changed, but that there was a slow processing. So you might imagine someone identifies this wheat product that people have managed to extract or feel like they're using as food, convenient. So they start to maybe take the seeds, put it in a specific place. Other technologies also help. So for example, we might think about the idea of humans starting to manage fire for the first time, create fire for themselves, and to keep it available for all sorts of things like hunting, protection, and maybe cooking. So the theory suggests this then requires less mobility. You don't have to be running around chasing the game or going out and gathering, because you can start to locate things in one place. So this saves energy for humans, thinking about us in a sort of a technical biological sense. So we can consume in a more efficient way, and we can also produce the food in a more efficient way. The suggestion is that this then helps a number of things. So maybe reduce mortality because people aren't having to run off quite as far. Maybe they don't fall down so many holes or pits. They don't get eaten as much by the megafauna that's protecting itself. Maybe we're getting better nutrition because they're able to eat more regularly, possibly. And with more leisure time, potentially this is going to increase the birth rate in the human population. So we've got all these things combining in potentially population increase. So this then has an effect with more individual members of a community who are able to communicate, to cooperate. There's more individuals to feed within the community, so there's a demand, but there's also more labour to be doing this. So maybe this then allows the intensification of this domestication of plants and maybe the holding of other animals as well. So then we get a feedback, a positive feedback, and the process slowly intensifies. So obviously, however, this innovation in human kind of socioeconomic organisation starts to have major implications for the wider environment. Let's skip a whole big chunk of history and let's think about a later agricultural revolution. The idea of the production of high-yield varieties. What knowledge do we have about these, please? What are high-yield varieties?
So when you have like a genetic predisposition to grow faster or bigger.
Yes, nice. So we identify these characteristics. Any other thoughts about how this works? Yeah.
I think it's an increase of calories per acre.
Yes. So the sort of the 50s, the 60s movement was about increasing the generation of calories and calorie density using the identification of traits in crops that had these characteristics. And this is considered to be of huge significance in the development of human food systems. So researchers started looking at the crops that were easy to produce on an mass industrial scale. So particularly if they were kind of uniform in size and shape, because this can affect how crops can be planted, crops can be sowed. There was also an overlap looking at how we could identify particular species of, say, wheat that would respond particularly well to that application of things like fertilizers and other chemical inputs. We wanted crops and individual species that would grow up fast to be mature so they could be harvested. And this overall, yes, had this effect of hugely expanding the potential of modified human food production. If we look at the Food and Agriculture Organization, I've taken this from a website that doesn't have a date on it. So it's fairly old data, but I think it still makes the point. We can see that with the introduction of high-yield varieties, we get a much greater increase, sort of much greater output in crop yields for all parts of the world. So this is significant in feeding a growing human population. Has anyone got any thoughts on less positive thoughts about this part of human food history? Yeah.
A lot of the original caterpillars that came into patterns species that own like carrot fish that moves on bones on fish, and then it kind of gets like subsistence trapped in the cycle of the release of different bylaws and then incorporated in the fertilizer at work on those food owned by the said institutions.
Yeah, so there's a political economy aspect of that. Can anyone relate that to something we did last week? What Alexandra has just described, how might what Alexandra has just described fit in to what we talked about last week? What did we do last week? Food regimes. What are food regimes about? As a headline. Yeah. The history of food systems. What are the things we're most interested in when we're using the food regimes lens to look at food history? Yeah, so we've got here a really nice example of how certain concentrations of capital and finance and technology structured a system which then also had its own kind of particular drivers. So you talked about the issues of intellectual property and what have you. So this can be a key moment in food regime change and process. Any other knowledge about why the green revolution was maybe not as green as we'd have liked it to be? Yeah.
I guess it might fuel population growth. So instead of being able to distribute food amongst all, it actually provides the far bad while there's enough food for everybody, so that's increase our growth rate.
Yes, okay, nice. And why might that not solve the problem? The fact we know there's suddenly a big jump in the volume of food produced, but what's the catch? Thinking about maybe food security? Go on, Elizabeth, what were you going to?
I was going to say that it's not distributed equitably between people. It's kind of like instantly by certain people.
Yes, absolutely. So we've got an issue of how this new resource is distributed. And if we now connect this just finally for our essay to showing we know about the concept of food security, what might be the connection there? What's food security? Is food security looking at the world and going, oh yeah, there's enough food in the kind of abstract sense? Yeah.
I guess just making sure that food's accessible, sort of economically, but then also physically, so as to avoid
Yes, nice. So we can kind of go from this idea of food not being available to everyone, thinking through the key concept of access to food and breaking it down into sort of physical access. Is it within a geography that I can reach? And even if it is within that geography, can I access it maybe because of financial reasons or not? So all this gives us a kind of a critique of some of the less maybe desirable aspects of the green revolution. So not only barriers to the outcomes of this in terms of getting the food, but also maybe to the technologies themselves. So farmers with the lowest capacity maybe couldn't interact with these technologies, couldn't interact with these technologies. The kind of the political economy, people getting, once you're into this socio-economic technical system, you're kind of maybe stuck in it. Lots of negative environmental impacts as well, arguably in hindsight. So a lot of these crops required a lot more water, so suddenly we get a huge expansion of water footprints. And also, just because you have the technology doesn't mean you as an individual can use it effectively. So in a lot of cases, these technologies were made available to people who didn't use them and were unable to use them in the most effective way. So this was a kind of less than ideal outcome. And obviously the key point here is the way that it sort of creates a step change in human modification of the ecological system. Yeah.
I don't really understand the second point.
This one. Yes. So if, for example, you're buying seeds, or if you're given seeds that are for plants that are kind of created to be sterile, so you have to buy new seeds every year, you're then locked into that cycle, because presumably if you haven't kept your old seed stock, then you'll rely upon the market to provide, as opposed to the more ecologically natural way. Thank you. Okay. And this, of course, part of the food regime's idea, the way that capital and technology starts to control our food system. We can't talk about the human modification of sort of naturally occurring ecological food systems without mentioning the rise of genetic technologies. Now, this isn't something that I'm going to pretend I know a lot about, but just to flag as a key subject which you may be interested in for your own research and assessment. We're talking about a key difference here. So something that always happened, going way back to the Fertile Crescent and the wheat, the idea of humans selecting species or individuals within a species that had desirable traits and kind of crossbreeding over time to see what happened and then selecting again. That's how, for the whole history of human agriculture, things have worked, until humans developed the ability to reach inside and to identify particular genes that they believe give certain traits. So then you don't have to wait for the breeding cycles to see what happens. You can start to do this much more precisely, at least in theory. According to the Royal Society, on a recent kind of summary, they still feel like there are significant problems. So things work well in the lab, then you put these species in a field, they behave very differently for a whole variety of reasons. There is a scientifically grounded concern about other unintended outcomes, and of course, an extension of the political economy argument. How does this play into the evolution of food regimes and people's financial and economic power over their food and what they want to eat? So, thinking about the broad history and some of the key moments that it might be worth reflecting on, I want to have a little think about the more specific impact that humans have made on natural ecology, and also to then explore questions about how that might be changed. So this is my, let's say this is my first agricultural revolution map of the human ecosystem. Just have a little look at what you think I've tried to represent there. How might this change if we were to do one for latter history, a more recent ecology map? Yeah. Less trees, more crops, yes, so less kind of coverage of naturally arising either food sources or other biotic components, more human-managed crop cover, absolutely.
Obviously, that's monocultures, so all things in like one area, so like the wheat in one area, or the livestock separated by species.
Nice, absolutely, yes, so we might see spatial changes in the way that these are laid out.
Less use of natural fertilizers and more artificial.
Ah, yes, nice. Absolutely. So more artificial fertilizers and other inputs. Same thing. Joe? More humans. Ah, yeah, that's a good one. And what did I actually go for? Yeah, so we've got the idea of greater concentration. So this, your point about the waste and the fertilizer was a bit more subtle. So I was thinking about sort of volume of waste out of the food system. But yeah, definitely the fertilization changes. We've got greater spatial concentrations, more human-managed species, less diversity as well. So let's have a slightly more technical think about these. So if we started to explore the idea of ecosystems existing in a series of nested scales, does anyone have any thoughts about what that might imply? So if you break it down, think about the idea of different scales, and then think about the idea of those being nested inside one another. Yeah.
Just that you have ecosystems that, along with other ecosystems, make up larger ecosystems, and then it kind of builds up from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I want to talk about this is I want you to be able to think about different scales when you're thinking about food production, and therefore all the kind of interconnections. So just as Joe said, we can look at our individual organism, which might be something we're considering as a source of food. We can look at its higher populations, the wider communities that it's involved with other species, broader ecosystems, and then beyond that, how these interconnect. So it changes with our spatial geographies. And we can think on a kind of smaller scale. So we might want to, and we might need to think about interactions with, at a scale of a few millimeters. So looking inside a square centimeter of soil as a particular ecosystem, and then looking up. The way that humans have managed food production involves a lot of management of kind of land and land formation. And a lot of analysis suggests, well, because of the sort of the social and technical drivers that have led to these particular divisions and arrangements, they're really nothing to do with the ecology of the area. So the spatial arrangement may not be ecologically optimal or in comparison with what could be there, which means that we're getting, in an ecological sense, inefficiencies and kind of problems getting created. We're also getting separations of managed areas from more natural ecosystems, which may be losing beneficial interactions. We can also think about this in terms of sort of scale and context, the difference between what happens in a laboratory and what happens when we put a crop out in the world, and it starts to interact with other elements that we may or may not expect to be there or want to be there. in terms of optimal outcomes. We also need to think about, I want you to think about the world as a 3D world. So not just as looking down on a map, thinking about spatial arrangements, but imagining ourselves standing in the environment, looking up and down and left and right, and 360 degrees. So if we take the example of a forest, did anyone do ecological principles? Did you guys look at like different layers of forests and things like that, or different layers in ecosystems? So I know when my colleagues talked about tropical forests in Panama, they talked about the different layers in a forest, the different components thereof, the different functions that were performed, and how all these things interacted for certain outcomes. So when you think about food systems, particular farm, I want you to consider that it has 3 dimensions. Also that maybe it's not the bits you can see that might be the most important. We might want to go this way, and we might need to think about what's happening in terms of the ecology underneath the ground, or underneath the water possibly, because these are really important elements of our human food system. Another change might be, another dimension in which to look at these things might be over time. So again, the drivers that have organized how humans have managed the production of food in a temporal sense may not be related to ecological processes. The fact that we have people producing lots of turkeys to be consumed about the time we call December is nothing to do with the ecological propriety of that. It's because we have Christmas, which is a human-created cultural thing. That may or may not have negative or positive, implications for the ecology of that production. So we need to think about 3D space and also time in terms of our impact. Thinking about spatial changes, habitat fragmentation. Who wants to tell us about that? Please.
So like essentially the landscape is, instead of being as one complete set piece, it is broken up into lots of smaller sections of land, and they'll essentially be like corridors, but then like not ecological corridors, the very, very opposite, and then you get like edge effects occurring around them.
Ooh, nice. Do you want to tell us a bit about the edge effect?
Edge effects are essentially just, where there's a barrier between a human, or not necessarily human, just like 2 separate systems around that area, where they interact, we're going to have, for example, like less biodiversity, because then we have like a road meeting a forest, there's going to be less animals living next to the road than there are going to be right in the middle of the forest, and so you get that sort of stuff.
Yeah, nice. So if we sort of, in a popular sense, imagine what a natural or wild landscape might look like, and then we compare it to a landscape that's been shaped by human activity, we see a change in the different functions of each space, divisions across it. So this looks like a human, at least managed watercourse. And we're going to see different effects at the edges of those going in one direction or another. And all of this is going to be changing the ecological interactions from a more naturalized or natural to human-managed state. And if we believe that these processes are important, it's something we need to be able to consider and analyze. Just to think about another way to do analysis, anyone familiar with the idea of complexity? Yeah, please.
It's essentially just the sort of components that go into what makes up a specific landscape. I think we've got like the mosaic or something like that.
Yeah.
That relates to, it is logically, like, it is what it says in the tin, how diverse it is.
Yeah, nice. So if we're thinking about the impact of human-managed food systems on the biosphere, on our ecosystem, we can think about it in these ways. So what is the degree of fragmentation? What is the degree of complexity in a system? And this leads into questions of, well, how diverse might it be in terms of different species, etc. Okay. And kind of digging down, well, why might this matter? We might be thinking about how it facilitates or doesn't the movement of animals and other biotic components around for a whole series of reasons in terms of their own reproduction, in terms of their own resource acquisition and management. We might think about, well, how stable is the presence of a certain population in a certain area? And does that have implications? Thinking about diversity and interactions. And if you're wondering why this might really matter, did anyone watch the video of the wolves in Yellowstone? I think it was Yellowstone Park that was linked from Environmental Principles. Do you remember what the broad message?
It was the fact that, so before they introduced the wolves, it was like overgrazing from here, I think, and there's a lot of problems like with the wolves running and stuff, and as soon as they added the wolves in a couple of years, the deer populations went down, the overgrazing stopped, the forest started to recover, and all of these like flooding events and stuff that were happening, which kind of stopped. Went from to be more natural rather than flooding and drought. A bit more constant.
Yeah, nice, thank you. So the principal point being that the human management of the different species that were in that ecosystem led through a whole cascade of changes through to where the river cut through the land. So just to illustrate that interventions can have profound outcomes, which may be supportive or unsupportive of a sustainable human existence. Just thinking about species, any thoughts about how many species humans have managed to capture and control over this 10,000-year period of agricultural development in terms of plants and animals?
Is it something like
16. Oh.
Like domesticated animals.
16 domesticated animals? That's crazy. That can't be true.
Like species.
What do we think? 16 of humans only manage 16 species for food of animals? What did you have for dinner last week? What animals did you eat? But yeah, absolutely. Humans have managed to make use of and control a very small proportion of species on the Earth. I mean, obviously these figures are contested, but I think the sort of the qualitative point stands. A lot more plants than animals, but if we're talking about, animal species that we use in our food system, and the argument is made that actually we haven't really changed much in the last 5,000 years. We've just kind of messed with the nuances of the management of these species. So we've got actually, in terms of the wider ecology, we've got access to and control of a very narrow range, which may create a vulnerability. Any thoughts about why we haven't managed to domesticate more animals that we can eat? Yeah, cultural norms. Have you got any examples?
Well, so like in some histories they use dogs, but here we don't do that because it's not culture based.
Yeah, nice. So kind of as a global community, there is some predation on these species, but this is geographically differentiated. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Like historical requirements, so say in South America or the Americas, the only domesticated herbivore is the alpaca,
Mm-hmm.
and that was in the Andes regions where it's a bit sparser and it's more required for. Plus, in other areas like in the rainforest and stuff, there's enough resources that you don't need to have domesticated large herbivores.
Ah.
Be quite difficult anyway.
Yes. Oh, nice. So there's a trade-off. Managing animals might be more difficult than accessing nutrition in other ways. Anyone ever tried domesticating a zebra? They really don't like it. They're not into it at all. Very aggressive response if you try and put a zebra in a field and set it up as part of your food system. So a whole load of kind of resistance of other species and a whole set of trade-offs in terms of efficiency for human management. So we've ended up sitting on quite a narrow food supply system. This is an important note. I found this book really interesting, but it's not, in the scholarship terms, it's not that great. There's a lot of claims in it that they don't have much evidence for. So do use it, and it's on the reading list, but don't necessarily believe everything they say, because I found some things that they tried to pass off as definite, like this is what people think, and it turns out that lots of people disagree. So just a little note on that. So to sort of kind of pull it together, what I want you to think about is the slow change in settled human living, so increasingly in one place, so less mobile communities, and increasing active management of land and of space with increasing complexity over time. The scale of human agricultural, domesticated agricultural system has increased through the application of capital and technology. So I would say all this is intimately related to food regimes ideas in the way that I understand things. And actually, if you wanted to write an innovative essay, you could say, let's add food regime interest to ecology interest. And let's do like a political ecology food regime essay. And Alistair would love that, and he'd give you a first if you did it well. So we could kind of combine these things. So we end up with the idea of, if this is kind of temporal scale, we've got a more intense ecological modification than in the past. And obviously, this is still geographically differentiated across the world. We've got increasing output and increasing concentrations of nutrients and waste, which I think might be worth thinking about. So I just want to, I thought I'd taken that out. Think about possible responses, because that's what we're interested in. As well as understanding the detail of the current situation, we want to think about how we might respond. So the first thing to say is that monoculture and conventional farming gets stereotyped as a bad thing, an unsustainable way. There's a lot of difference within that, and we'll talk about that in a future week. So maybe we've got these categories of conventional and alternative food production methods as a way to think about things. And if you look across the literature and the practice, there's a whole range of responses that have emerged to a critique of the fact that humans have overmanaged the ecology of our food production. So we've got agroforestry, biodynamic, conservation. Someone was talking about hydroponics and permaculture, I think, last week. So there's a whole range of ideas out there. And just to give you a definition to hang your thinking on, so I think I like this idea of agroecology. So it's the application of ecological concepts, thinking principles, to the design of management. So not necessarily a specific thing, but this whole week is encouraging you to think in terms of agroecology and agriculture related to ecological principles. And the reason I like it is because we've got a nice way in here. This can provide insight on how to deal with questions at the systems level. So we're not just zooming in, being super specific straight away. We're saying, how does this connect to a wider set of systems? And how can we manage this? I just want to finish on one final point of nuance. Agroecology, again, is a really broad church. So this is one example. This is taking my students around a cacao farm in Panama. Very natural forest, very unmanaged in terms of its human engagement. This is another example of agroecology. Very highly managed, spatially very highly managed in terms of its diversity. So let's not get sucked into thinking that in stereotyped ways about conventional and agroecology, or one thing is definitely this, one thing is definitely that. The whole point is about moving towards more sustainable outcomes, but recognizing that there's always going to be a trade-off. If you do one thing, you will get a different outcome, and you may have to choose one thing over another thing. There probably isn't one super easy, no problem solution response out there. If there was, we wouldn't need to be talking about it. Other people would be doing it. So it's all about thinking through the details and the nuances of the ecological impact processes and possibilities, I would argue, as GSD students interested in food. So we will stop there. In our workshops, we will think in much more detail about how to respond to this situation. Mm.